The summer heat shimmered off the asphalt as two cars pulled into the rest stop, their engines ticking as they cooled. It was one of those perfect afternoons that felt like destiny was riding itself across the highway. She had been driving her car, her pride and joy, a vehicle she'd worked countless hours to afford and modify, when she noticed another car that matched hers almost perfectly. The same make, similar modifications, the kind of attention to detail that spoke of genuine passion rather than mere ownership. What started as a casual conversation about horsepower and suspension setups at an impromptu car show became something neither of them had expected. There was an immediate connection, the kind that car enthusiasts rarely find, someone who understood the joy of a perfectly timed shift, the satisfaction of a well-executed modification, the almost spiritual connection between driver and machine. They talked for hours in that parking lot, the sun setting around them as they discovered they shared more than just automotive passion. The early days of their relationship felt like a love story written by someone who understood what real connection looked like. They weren't just dating, they were building something together. Their matching cars became a symbol of how perfectly they fit, how they seemed designed for each other. Friends would joke about the couple with the twin cars, but it represented something deeper. They were partners in the truest sense, sharing passions, dreams, and a vision of the future that felt solid and real. He integrated into her life seamlessly, becoming not just her boyfriend but her best friend, her confidant, her partner in everything. Her family adored him, and his family welcomed her with open arms. It was the kind of relationship that made other people believe in love again, the kind that looked effortless from the outside because it felt so natural on the inside. As their relationship deepened over the months that followed, she found herself taking care of him in ways that felt both natural and necessary. She had always been independent, financially stable, and emotionally strong, but with him, she discovered the joy of nurturing someone she loved. When he struggled financially, she stepped in without hesitation. When he battled with depression and anxiety, she became his anchor, his safe harbor in emotional storms. She worked extra hours to support both of them, not because she had to, but because she wanted to build something lasting. Her vision extended far beyond just getting by. She was planning for their future together. The decision to work part-time and return to school full-time wasn't just about her own ambitions. It was about creating a foundation that would allow both of them to pursue what truly made them happy. The garage renovation project represented everything she believed their relationship could be. $10,000 was a significant investment, but she saw it as an investment in their shared future. This wasn't just about having a place to live, it was about creating a space where they could both thrive. The two-car detached garage would be their sanctuary, a place where they could work on their cars together, where she could study while he pursued his passions, where they could build the life they had dreamed about during those long conversations that stretched late into the night. Her friends sometimes wondered if she was doing too much, giving too much, but she genuinely couldn't understand their concern. When you love someone completely, when you've found your person, supporting them doesn't feel like sacrifice, it feels like investment in your shared happiness. She had never felt more certain about anything in her life than she felt about him, about them, about the future they were building together. June 15th marked their one-year anniversary, a milestone that felt both significant and natural. They celebrated quietly, intimately, the way couples do when they're secure in their love and don't need grand gestures to prove anything to anyone. It felt like the first of many anniversaries they would celebrate, a foundational date in what would become their love story. From the outside, their relationship appeared flawless. They had the kind of connection that made other couples slightly envious: genuine laughter, shared interests, mutual respect, and obvious affection. They supported each other's goals, celebrated each other's successes, and navigated challenges as a team. Her family loved him like a son, and his family had embraced her completely. Wedding plans felt like a natural next step, not a rushed decision but the obvious conclusion to a love story that had unfolded with remarkable ease. But beneath this perfect surface, a different story was being written, one she knew nothing about. While she worked overtime to support their future, while she planned and saved and dreamed, he was living a parallel life that would have been unrecognizable to her. The phone that sat innocuously on their shared nightstand contained a history that would shatter everything she believed about their relationship. The cruel irony was that her trust in him was so complete, so absolute, that she never even considered looking. She had been in relationships before where suspicion and jealousy were constant companions, and she had promised herself that she would never live that way again. With him, she didn't have to. Or so she believed. The digital age has created new possibilities for betrayal, new ways to compartmentalize lives and maintain multiple relationships simultaneously. His deception was facilitated by platforms designed for temporary communication, messages that disappeared, photos that vanished after viewing. Snapchat became the vehicle for maintaining connections that had no place in a committed relationship. The ex-girlfriend remained a constant presence in his life, their communication disguised as emotional support and old friendship. Every 2 weeks, like clockwork, he would call her to talk about his depression, to share feelings and vulnerabilities that should have been reserved for his committed relationship. He painted himself as isolated and misunderstood, someone who needed her unique understanding and support, effectively erasing his fiancée's presence and care from the narrative of his life. The pattern extended beyond just one person. There were girls from his past, former partners who remained active participants in his present. The communication wasn't limited to words. Intimate photos and videos were exchanged regularly, sometimes while she slept unknowingly beside him. The physical boundaries of their shared space meant nothing when digital intimacy could be conducted in silence, in darkness, mere feet away from his unsuspecting partner. The timing of these communications was perhaps the most cruel aspect of his betrayal. Some of the most intimate exchanges happened during periods when she was most vulnerable, most generous, most committed to their future together. While she was working extra hours to fund their shared dreams, he was sharing intimate moments with other women. While she was sacrificing her immediate comfort for their long-term goals, he was prioritizing immediate gratification over their relationship's integrity. 4 a.m. is an hour that belongs to emergencies and revelations, to moments when the thin veneer of normalcy gets stripped away to reveal truth underneath. The phone call came with the abrupt intensity of a fire alarm, shocking her from sleep into a reality she couldn't have imagined. The voice on the other end belonged to his ex-girlfriend, a woman whose name she knew but whom she had never considered a threat. The conversation was surreal in its mixture of confession and compassion. This woman, who had been receiving intimate attention from her fiancé, was calling to warn her, to provide evidence, to offer the kind of brutal honesty that would destroy her world but might save her future. The motivation seemed to be genuine care rather than malice. She was in a happy relationship herself now, and perhaps that happiness had given her perspective on what she had been participating in. The evidence was comprehensive and undeniable. Screenshots, photos taken by her new boyfriend of the communications on his phone, dates and times that created an irrefutable timeline of betrayal. This wasn't a case of misunderstanding or misinterpretation. It was a carefully documented history of infidelity that spanned their entire relationship. After the call ended, she sat in the darkness processing information that felt impossible to reconcile with the life she thought she was living. The man sleeping peacefully beside her, the man she was planning to marry, the man she had just invested $10,000 in a future with, was a stranger. Everything she thought she knew about their relationship, about him, about herself, had to be reconsidered in light of this new information. The walk she took after that phone call was a journey through her own neighborhood that felt like traveling through a foreign country. Every familiar landmark, the house where the elderly couple waved from their porch, the corner where she and her fiancé had stopped to help a stranded motorist, the coffee shop where they'd spent lazy Sunday mornings, now existed in a different reality, one where her relationship had been a lie. The physical movement helped process what her mind couldn't yet fully grasp. Step by step, she walked through the implications of what she'd learned. The future they'd planned together, the renovated garage, the part-time work schedule, the wedding they'd been discussing, all of it had been built on a foundation that didn't exist. She had been planning a life with someone who was, essentially, a character he'd created for her benefit. When she returned home, she stood in the doorway of their bedroom watching him sleep. This moment, seeing him peaceful and unaware while she carried the weight of his betrayal, crystallized something important about their relationship. She had been protecting him from consequences, supporting him through difficulties, nurturing his well-being, while he had been systematically undermining the very foundation of their connection. Taking his phone was an action she had never imagined herself capable of. She had always prided herself on trusting completely, on never being the kind of person who snooped or invaded privacy. But the evidence she'd been presented with demanded verification, and her own sanity required confirmation that what she'd been told was true. What she found in his phone transcended simple infidelity and entered the realm of systematic deception. This wasn't about momentary weakness or occasional lapses in judgment. It was about maintaining multiple relationships simultaneously, each carefully compartmentalized to prevent discovery. The digital evidence painted a picture of someone living parallel lives with such skill that she wondered if she had ever known the real person at all. The communications revealed not just physical betrayal but emotional intimacy with multiple people. He shared thoughts, feelings, and experiences with others that he had never shared with her. She discovered that many of the stories he'd told her about his past, his feelings, his struggles, had been edited versions designed to maintain certain relationships while protecting others. Perhaps most devastating was discovering the timing of these communications. Messages sent while she was in the next room making dinner for them both. Photos exchanged while she was working overtime to fund their future. Video calls scheduled during times when she was occupied with supporting their shared life in practical ways. The juxtaposition of her devotion and his deception created a cognitive dissonance that was almost impossible to process. The investigation revealed layers of betrayal that extended beyond the romantic and into the realm of fundamental honesty about who he was as a person. She found evidence of lies about finances, about his job situation, about his relationships with friends and family. The man she thought she knew well enough to marry was, in many ways, a fiction. The process of gathering his belongings from her house was methodical and strange. Each item she collected, his clothes, his toiletries, the books he'd left on her nightstand, represented a piece of the life they'd built together that was now being dismantled. The physical act of erasing his presence from her space was both necessary and surreal. Waking him to confront the evidence was perhaps the hardest thing she'd ever had to do. Despite everything she'd discovered, despite the overwhelming proof of his betrayal, some part of her still hoped there might be an explanation that would make sense of the senseless. The transition from his sleepy confusion to his dawning realization was horrible to witness, even knowing what he'd done. His reaction when the reality of discovery hit him was extreme and genuine. The denial gave way quickly to desperate pleading, to promises and explanations that came too late to matter. The man who had been so careful about maintaining his deceptions, so skilled at compartmentalizing his relationships, completely fell apart when confronted with the consequences of his choices. The scene that followed was one of complete emotional breakdown. His pleas weren't manipulative or calculated, they seemed to come from genuine anguish at losing what they'd built together. This made the situation even more confusing and painful. If his distress at losing her was real, if his love for her was genuine, how could he have risked it all so repeatedly and so carelessly? Calling his father was a practical necessity. He was in no condition to drive safely, but it also represented the end of their shared privacy. The secret was out, their relationship was over, and family members would now be involved in the aftermath. The life they'd built together was not just ending, it was exploding outward into the lives of everyone who cared about them. The most confusing aspect of the entire situation was the genuine nature of his love for her alongside the systematic nature of his betrayal. This wasn't a case of a man who didn't care about his partner or who was secretly unhappy in the relationship. By all evidence, he truly loved her, genuinely appreciated everything she did for him, and was sincerely committed to their future together. This paradox made processing the betrayal exponentially more difficult. If he had been a bad partner in other ways, if he had been unkind, unsupportive, or obviously uncommitted, the infidelity would have fit into a pattern that made sense. Instead, she was forced to grapple with the reality that someone could love her deeply and still betray her systematically. The way he treated her in every other aspect of their relationship had been exemplary. He was affectionate, supportive, grateful for her care, and genuinely excited about their future together. He participated fully in their shared life, integrated completely with her family, and showed every sign of being committed to their relationship. The cognitive dissonance between his behavior toward her and his behavior with others was almost impossible to reconcile. This complexity made well-meaning advice from friends and family particularly difficult to hear. People who saw how much they loved each other, who witnessed the genuine connection they shared, couldn't understand why she wouldn't try to work through the betrayal. The love was real, they argued, and real love was worth fighting for. But they didn't understand that the betrayal was also real, and systematic, and ongoing throughout their entire relationship. The aftermath of discovery brought a new kind of torment in the form of pressure from everyone around her to reconsider her decision to end the relationship. Friends, family members, and even his family members who had welcomed her so completely all seemed to believe that love should be enough to overcome betrayal, that forgiveness was not just possible but obligatory given the depth of their connection. The arguments were compelling in their way. He was clearly devastated by the loss of their relationship. His mental health struggles were genuine and worrying. They had built something beautiful together, and throwing it away over mistakes that were now in the past seemed wasteful to those observing from the outside. The investment she'd made, emotional, financial, and practical, represented too much to simply walk away from. But these well-meaning attempts at reconciliation failed to account for the systematic nature of his deception. This wasn't about forgiving a single mistake or working through a rough patch in their relationship. This was about accepting that the foundation of their relationship had been compromised from the beginning, that the person she thought she was in love with had never existed in the way she believed. The pressure was particularly intense because his family genuinely cared about her and wanted to preserve the relationship that had brought so much happiness to everyone involved. They focused on his current pain and regret rather than the calculated nature of his long-term deception. Their desire to soothe his immediate suffering sometimes conflicted with helping him understand the true consequences of his choices. Perhaps the most emotionally exhausting aspect of the entire situation was her continued concern for his well-being despite what he'd done to her. The capacity for care that had made her such a devoted partner didn't simply disappear when she discovered his betrayal. She could see that he was genuinely struggling, that the loss of their relationship was devastating to him, and despite everything, she couldn't simply stop caring about his welfare. This compassion created an additional burden during an already overwhelming time. While she was processing her own trauma, grief, and anger, she also felt responsible for managing his emotional crisis. The same nurturing instinct that had made her support him financially and emotionally throughout their relationship now made it difficult for her to simply walk away and let him deal with the consequences of his choices alone. The complexity of caring about someone who had hurt her so deeply was something most people around her couldn't understand. They either expected her to hate him completely or to forgive him completely, but neither response matched the reality of her experience. She could simultaneously recognize that he needed help and support while also maintaining that she couldn't be the person to provide it. This internal conflict was exhausting and isolating. She found herself defending her decision to people who couldn't understand why she wouldn't try to save the relationship, while also defending her continued concern for his welfare to people who thought she should simply cut all ties and move on. Neither position adequately captured the complexity of loving someone who had betrayed her trust so completely. June 15th had been their anniversary, a day of celebration and affirmation of their love for each other. June 17th, she later discovered, was the last day he sent intimate messages and photos to other women. The proximity of these dates created a particularly cruel irony. He had been celebrating their relationship while simultaneously maintaining intimate connections with others right up until the moment his deception was exposed. This timeline revealed something important about the nature of his betrayal. It wasn't that he had made mistakes early in their relationship and then committed fully to her. It wasn't that he had struggled with fidelity and gradually overcome his issues. He had been actively betraying her trust right up until the moment he was caught, with no apparent plan to end these other relationships voluntarily. The discovery that his infidelity had continued so recently made the betrayal feel even more immediate and intentional. If there had been months or years between his last indiscretion and their engagement, it might have been possible to view his behavior as past mistakes that he had outgrown. Instead, she was forced to confront the reality that he had been deceiving her actively and recently, that their engagement had not changed his behavior in any meaningful way. This recent timeline also meant that every memory from the past few months was now suspect. Conversations they'd had about their future, intimate moments they'd shared, decisions she'd made based on trust in their relationship, all of it had occurred while he was maintaining intimate connections with other people. The betrayal wasn't just about what he'd done, it was about the context in which their entire recent relationship had occurred. The $10,000 she had planned to invest in renovating the garage represented more than just money, it represented her complete faith in their future together. This wasn't an impulsive financial decision or a romantic gesture. it was a calculated investment in what she believed would be their shared life for years to come. The money would have allowed her to work part-time while attending school full-time, creating a foundation for a career that would benefit both of them long-term. The timing of the discovery, literally the day before they were supposed to sign the lease agreement, felt like a cruel intervention by fate. One more day, and she would have been legally and financially committed to a living situation based on a relationship that was built on deception. The money would have been spent, the arrangements would have been formalized, and extricating herself from this situation would have been exponentially more complicated. This near miss highlighted how close she had come to making life decisions based on false information about her relationship. The garage renovation was just one example of how his deception had the potential to impact her future in concrete, practical ways. If his betrayal hadn't been discovered when it was, she might have found herself legally and financially entangled in ways that would have made leaving much more difficult. The loss of this planned future was its own form of grief. She had to mourn not just the relationship she thought she had, but also the specific future she had been working toward. The part-time job, the return to school, the life in the renovated garage, all of these plans had to be abandoned and reimagined without him as part of the picture. One of the most difficult aspects of the entire experience was the loneliness that came with being the only person who fully understood the scope of his betrayal. While friends and family members knew that infidelity had occurred, they didn't have access to the comprehensive evidence she had seen. They didn't understand the systematic nature of his deception, the calculated way he had compartmentalized his relationships, or the extent to which their entire relationship had been built on lies. This created a strange isolation where she was simultaneously surrounded by people offering advice and support while feeling fundamentally alone in her understanding of what had actually happened. Well-meaning friends would suggest that everyone makes mistakes, that love was worth fighting for, that couples had worked through worse problems. But they were responding to what they imagined had happened rather than the reality of what she had discovered. The digital nature of much of his betrayal made it even more difficult to convey the full scope of what she'd learned. Describing the extent of his communications with other women, the timing of his deceptions, and the systematic way he had maintained multiple relationships required sharing details that were both intimate and humiliating. She found herself trying to explain the unexplainable to people who hadn't seen the evidence firsthand. This isolation was compounded by her own disbelief at what she'd discovered. Even with comprehensive evidence, part of her mind struggled to accept that the person she thought she knew could have deceived her so thoroughly. If she was having trouble integrating this new information about him, it was understandable that others who knew him less intimately would find it difficult to believe. Despite the pressure from others and her own continued care for his welfare, she found within herself a clarity about what needed to happen. The decision to end their relationship wasn't made in anger or hurt, though both emotions were certainly present. It was made from a deep understanding that the foundation of their relationship had been compromised in ways that couldn't be repaired. This clarity came from recognizing that staying with him would require her to accept a version of love that included systematic deception. It would mean agreeing that his love for her was compatible with maintaining intimate relationships with other women throughout their engagement. It would mean building a future on the understanding that his commitment to her didn't preclude emotional and physical intimacy with others. The strength to maintain this position despite enormous pressure was something she didn't know she possessed until it was tested. People she cared about were disappointed in her decision. His family, who had become like family to her, were pleading with her to reconsider. He himself was in genuine crisis over the loss of their relationship. Standing firm in her decision meant accepting that she would be seen as unforgiving, inflexible, or unwilling to fight for love. But she understood something that others didn't. Staying would have required her to fundamentally change her understanding of what love and commitment meant. It would have meant accepting that betrayal was compatible with devotion, that systematic deception was a forgivable aspect of an otherwise loving relationship. This wasn't a boundary she was willing to cross, even for someone she loved deeply. August represented both an ending and a beginning. Her lease would expire, giving her a natural opportunity to make the geographic change that felt necessary for moving forward. The decision to leave the state wasn't made in anger or as an attempt to punish him. It was recognition that staying in the same environment would make healing exponentially more difficult. The plan to relocate represented a choice to prioritize her own recovery over maintaining comfort for others. Friends and family who wanted her to stay and work things out with him couldn't understand why she felt the need to physically remove herself from the situation. But she recognized that staying would mean constant reminders of what she'd lost, continued pressure to reconsider her decision, and ongoing temptation to prioritize his emotional needs over her own healing. The timeline gave her a few months to wrap up her life in a place that had become associated with the most significant betrayal she'd ever experienced. This wasn't just about changing addresses. It was about creating the space and distance necessary to rebuild her understanding of herself and her capacity for trust in relationships. The decision to leave also represented a choice to start over rather than trying to rebuild from the wreckage of what she'd discovered. Rather than attempting to create new memories in the same places where she'd been deceived, she chose to seek out entirely new environments where she could begin to heal without constant reminders of what she'd lost. Her commitment to being a good person during her remaining time in the state created its own set of challenges. This meant continuing to show care for his welfare despite what he'd done to her. It meant trying to help his family understand her decision without completely destroying their image of him. It meant managing her own healing process while also being mindful of the impact her choices had on others who cared about both of them. This desire to remain compassionate and fair even in the aftermath of betrayal was both admirable and potentially self-destructive. The same qualities that had made her such a devoted partner, her capacity for putting others' needs first, her instinct to nurture and protect, now made it difficult for her to simply focus on her own recovery without worrying about everyone else affected by the situation. The challenge was finding ways to be kind and fair without compromising her own boundaries or enabling his avoidance of the full consequences of his choices. She wanted to help him get the support he needed for his mental health struggles, but she also needed to make clear that this support couldn't come from her and that her decision to leave wasn't conditional on his recovery. This balancing act was exhausting and often felt impossible. Every choice she made seemed to require weighing her own needs against her concern for others, her desire to heal against her instinct to care for someone who was struggling. The complexity of trying to be good to someone who had fundamentally betrayed her trust was something for which there was no clear roadmap. Throughout the ordeal, she questioned whether she was as strong as she believed herself to be. The pressure to reconcile, the genuine love she still felt for him, and the concern for his welfare all created moments of doubt about her decision to leave. Strength, she was learning, wasn't about never feeling uncertain. It was about acting in accordance with her values even when those actions were difficult and painful. The kind of strength required to leave someone you love because they betrayed your trust is different from the strength required to stay and work through problems together. Both choices require courage, but they demand different kinds of sacrifice. Staying would have required sacrificing her boundaries and her understanding of what commitment meant. Leaving required sacrificing the future she'd planned and the relationship that had brought her genuine happiness alongside genuine pain. She discovered that strength sometimes looked like disappointing people you care about, standing firm in decisions that others viewed as mistakes, and prioritizing your own welfare even when doing so causes pain to others. This kind of strength was lonely and often felt selfish, but she began to understand that it was necessary for her long-term well-being. The questioning of her own strength was perhaps natural given the magnitude of what she was walking away from. The relationship had brought her genuine joy, his family had become important to her, and the future they'd planned together had felt not just desirable but achievable. Choosing to give all of that up required faith in her own judgment that was constantly being challenged by well-meaning people around her. As August approached, she began the practical work of disentangling her life from his and preparing for a future that looked completely different from what she'd planned just months before. This involved not just physical preparations like finding a new place to live and transferring her job or school plans, but also the emotional work of reimagining what her life could look like without him in it. The process of moving forward required her to grieve not just the relationship she thought she had, but also the version of herself that had existed within that relationship. The woman who had trusted completely, who had planned their future with absolute certainty, who had invested so deeply in someone else's welfare, that version of herself had to be mourned and integrated into a new understanding of who she was and what she was capable of surviving. She found herself having to rediscover what she enjoyed, what she wanted, and what she valued outside of the context of their relationship. For over a year, her decisions had been made with their shared future in mind. Now she had to remember how to make choices based solely on her own desires and needs, a skill that felt rusty from disuse. The commitment to remaining kind and supportive during this transition period was both admirable and challenging. She wanted to leave in a way that didn't create additional damage for him or his family, but she also needed to protect her own emotional well-being during an already difficult time. This balance required constant negotiation between her compassionate instincts and her need for self-preservation. The experience forced her to reconsider fundamental assumptions about love, trust, and relationships that had guided her adult life. She had believed that genuine love was incompatible with systematic betrayal, that someone who truly cared about you wouldn't be able to deceive you so thoroughly. The discovery that these beliefs weren't necessarily true left her having to reconstruct her understanding of human nature and relationships. The paradox of his genuine love for her existing alongside his betrayal of her challenged everything she thought she knew about how relationships worked. This wasn't a case of someone who didn't care enough. It was about someone who compartmentalized his life in ways that allowed him to maintain multiple relationships simultaneously. Understanding this required her to accept a level of complexity in human behavior that she hadn't previously acknowledged. The experience also taught her about the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. She could forgive him for the pain he'd caused while still recognizing that their relationship couldn't continue. Forgiveness didn't require her to accept behavior that violated her fundamental boundaries. It simply required her to release the anger and resentment that would otherwise consume her own happiness. Perhaps most importantly, she learned about her own capacity for survival and self-advocacy. Despite enormous pressure from multiple directions, despite her genuine love for him, and despite her natural instinct to nurture and protect, she found the strength to prioritize her own well-being and maintain boundaries that others couldn't understand or support. The impact of this experience would extend far beyond the immediate aftermath of discovery and separation. Trust, once shattered so completely, would require years to rebuild, not just trust in romantic partners, but trust in her own judgment about people and relationships. The confidence with which she had planned their future together, the certainty she had felt about his character and their compatibility, all of it had been proven wrong in the most painful way possible. Future relationships would be approached with the knowledge that someone could love her genuinely while simultaneously betraying her systematically. This wasn't paranoia or inability to trust. It was integration of difficult knowledge about human complexity and the ways that people can compartmentalize their behavior. Learning to love again while holding this knowledge would be one of the greatest challenges of her recovery. The financial impact of the situation, the money she hadn't invested, the plans she'd had to abandon, the cost of relocating, was significant but manageable. The emotional cost was immeasurable and would take years to fully process. The therapy, the sleepless nights, the constant questioning of her own judgment, the loneliness of making difficult decisions that others couldn't understand, all of this represented an investment in her own healing that she hadn't planned to make. But perhaps the most profound legacy of the experience was the discovery of her own strength and capacity for self-advocacy. She had learned that she could survive the loss of someone she loved deeply when staying would have required compromising her fundamental values. She had learned that she could make difficult decisions despite pressure from people she cared about. She had learned that being good didn't require sacrificing her own well-being for others' comfort. The highway that had brought them together would eventually take her away from everything they'd built. The symbolic nature of this wasn't lost on her. The same road that had led to love would lead to liberation. The matching cars that had once represented their perfect compatibility would go their separate ways, heading toward different futures that no longer included each other. As she prepared to leave the state, to start over in a place where no one knew their story, she carried with her hard-won wisdom about love, trust, and the importance of self-preservation. The experience had been devastating, but it had also been revelatory. She had learned what she was capable of surviving, what she was willing to accept, and what she would never compromise on again. The future stretched ahead of her uncertain but full of possibility. There would be other relationships, other opportunities for love and connection, other chances to build something meaningful with someone else. But she would approach those opportunities with different knowledge, different boundaries, and different appreciation for her own strength and worth. The woman who had trusted completely, who had given everything to someone who betrayed that trust, was gone. In her place was someone stronger, wiser, and more self-aware. The pain of losing the relationship was real and lasting, but so was the growth that came from surviving it. The highway ahead was unknown, but she was driving it with hard-won confidence in her own ability to navigate whatever came next. And perhaps that, ultimately, was the real love story, not the one that had ended in betrayal, but the one that was just beginning, the one where she learned to love and protect herself with the same devotion she had once given to someone else. The highway stretched ahead, full of possibilities for someone brave enough to drive it alone.